already, and ReMarcs is live.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today's date is February 23rd, 2021. I'm Marc Morial, and this is ReMarcs Live, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for a fast-paced 15 or so minutes, because I've got a very, very special guest with us today, and he and I are going to have a great, engaging conversation. But once again, thank all of you for joining. Let me make a few notes. Two important hearings taking place on Capitol Hill today. The continuation of the confirmation hearings for President Biden's nominee for Attorney General Merrick Garland, and hearings on the Capitol riot of January 6th, with law enforcement and military officials testifying before Capitol Hill. And also, on a sad note, this is the 1-year anniversary, 1 year since the tragic death of Ahmaud Arbery. And Ahmaud Arbery, of course, the young man in Georgia who was minding his business, walking down a street, who ended up losing his life in a confrontation with two self-anointed vigilantes. Again, one of the precursors to the acceleration of the movement for Black lives and Black justice of 2020. But let me tell you who's with us today, ladies and gentlemen, urban leaders and friends. We have our 7th president, Hugh Price, with us. Hugh Price served as president of the National Urban League in the 90s and the early 2000s, as a distinguished lawyer, author, educator, scholar. Spent his early career in legal services, working for the New York Times, at the Rockefeller Foundation, at WNET New York. Great contributions, and then an important time in the history of the National Urban League in the 1990s. So Hugh, thank you for being with us today. We're honored, and we want to thank you for your service, your legacy, and your great career. And I just want to begin because I think your upbringing is fascinating. The conversation we had about Lewis Latimer is so fascinating. And maybe you want to spend a few minutes and just talk about your upbringing. I think it's so important for people in this generation to understand not only where you are, but where you started.
Well, it's interesting. Through a series of accidents of history, I have very interesting ancestral roots. My great-great-great-great-grandfather, Nero Hawley, fought in the American Revolution and served at Valley Forge under the command of General George Washington. And he was living in Connecticut, and that was the way in which slaves in Connecticut could gain their freedom, by serving in the American Revolution. My great-great-great-grandparents, George and Rebecca Latimer, were famous fugitive slaves who escaped from Norfolk, Virginia in 1842. They went up to Massachusetts. Their slave master tried to recapture them, and there was a big effort up there to prevent George Latimer particularly from being recaptured. And that was the first case that the young adult Frederick Douglass got involved in as an abolitionist. Their son was my great-grand-uncle, Lewis Latimer, the very famous inventor who helped Alexander Graham Bell get his patent for the first time, and who also perfected the light bulb that Thomas Edison had invented that burned out pretty quickly. From my father's side, who purchased his freedom in the late 1830s. And then, interestingly enough, he bought his wife and bought his children so that he could prevent them from being seized by any other slave owners. And then lastly, my father's grandfather was born into slavery, and as soon as slavery ended in Charleston, Maryland, he purchased a lot of land and became a self-reliant farmer. So he was part of that first generation of amazingly self-reliant people. So all of this is embedded in the DNA. I didn't know, but it probably helps explain why I ended up at the Urban League, because all these folks spent their lives trying to get ahead, get forward, get free, and get on with getting into the American mainstream.
Talk about the segregated Washington you grew up in, which I think is always a fascinating story about Washington, D.C., which was really a southern city. Many people don't classify it as such, but talk a little bit about the segregated Washington.
It wasn't violent the way the Deep South was. You know, we didn't have lynchings when I was growing up in Washington, but Our public schools were segregated. There was only about one restaurant in downtown Washington where Black folks could eat. There was only about one movie theater that we could go to. There was an amusement park in Virginia outside of Washington called Glen Echo, but we weren't allowed to go there. So it was a lockdown, stone cold, segregated city. There was even a place on Calorama Road, which is where the Obamas lived, where there used to be a roller rink. And we used to go to the roller rink. It was integrated, and that's where we went to check out the girls. But there was a bowling alley in the basement of the same building, and they wouldn't let us come into the bowling alley because it was segregated. So Washington was a segregated southern city, make no mistake about it. We never ventured outside of the DC limits because it was even more segregated. And a lot of this began to change with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954 that desegregated the public schools, and there was a companion decision called Bowling v. Sharp, which applied to the DC schools. And I was part of the first contingent of Black students to integrate the Washington, D.C. schools in 1954 when I entered Taft Junior High School in the 8th grade. So it was real. It was real. Now,
But you know, Washington also had great institutions like Dunbar High and Howard University, and an order of institutions that nurtured, I think, a class of leaders and a class of pride in Washington, D.C. And when I go to Washington today, I'm always concerned that that part of Washington's history is going to be forgotten. It's going to be marginalized by this new sort of gentrified Washington. You know, I had the opportunity to spend the early 80s in Washington at Georgetown University Law Center, and loved Washington, thought I would make my life in Washington when I was there. And so many people were part of that that institutional framework of a great deal of pride and energy that animated Washington in the 70s and 80s.
It's interesting because my father and my wife's parents all went to Dunbar. My father went on to Howard Medical School. They had many friends and peers who went to Dunbar and then came back and were affiliated with Howard. So Howard was the epicenter of our world. I mean, Dunbar was the feeder, Howard was the epicenter. And my parents' friends and neighbors were people like Charles Hamilton Houston. Samuel Lacey, who was a crusading sports reporter. And Montague Cobb, who was my wife's uncle, who was a great medical expert. Charles Drew, discovered blood plasma. My brother's married to his eldest daughter. That was our world. And to your point, the ethos that you inherited then was, you don't internalize the stuff that people try to impose on you. Don't internalize any inferiority that they try to lay on you. Your goal is to get through the obstacles in front of you of segregation. So you blast through them, you climb up over top of them, you go around them, or you tunnel underneath. But the point is to keep moving forward.
No, I think it's a powerful, powerful story. And I think your life is so interesting, not only your ancestry, but your upbringing. I want to talk a little bit now about your time at the League. What do you remember the most? What's your fondest memory? What's your sense of those times, you know, the 90s and the early 2000s? Talk a little bit about that period.
Right. When I arrived in 94, the policy environment on the national level was pretty dicey. Bill Clinton, Democrat, which is great, but he was a centrist, or talk about the third way. So he had promoted welfare reform, ending, putting time limits on welfare. He promoted very harsh anti-crime measures. He did not have an explicit Black agenda. And in 94, Newt Gingrich and the GOP had just taken over the House, and with their contract with America. So the Washington environment was not a hospital one from a policy point of view. There was also a relentless assault on affirmative action, very well financed by conservatives. And while police brutality wasn't a really hot issue in 94, it became a hot issue very soon after. So that was, and relations between the Black and Jewish communities was at a nadir. It was really tough environment. I mean, you walked into tough, we all seem to walk into tough environments when we take this
Yeah,
job.
right.
My challenge on a personal level was that I wasn't really very well known nationally, and I wasn't known in the urban league movement. And people said, well, you're not a veteran of the civil rights movement, or there was a veteran of the anti-poverty movement in the North. And I also have never been a stem winding speaker or preacher. So I had to figure out what to do with my speaking opportunities, which were going to be numerous. And as a policy wonk, I tried to figure out how to maximize the impact of my speeches and to use them as teaching opportunities to talk about the challenges that we. And for the organization, the fundamental challenge was how to take a revered and venerable movement and transition 20th century movement and transition it to the 21st century. And that can be wrenching, but I mean, this too. If organizations don't evolve,
They die.
And I used to get calls from the great Reverend Leon Sullivan, impromptu calls, and he would call me and say, Hugh, a lot of our organizations are in trouble. The National Urban League is the only one still standing. Don't let it die. Bye. I said, that's
it's so fascinating. One of my law school classmates, Judge Renee Cardwell Hughes, just took over as a new CEO of OIC. She and I are going to be talking next week.
Okay.
She was a common pleas court judge in Philadelphia for many, many years. But, as you certainly mentioned that, I will say, and I want to let you know that the creation of the National Urban League Young Professionals, which you birthed and got started, and which I've taken and literally put it on steroids now, over 10,000 with almost 70 chapters, was brilliant in that it created a mechanism to bring a new generation of leaders in. And in my early days, there were some execs who were anti the young professionals. And I'm sure you experienced that too.
Yeah.
And I told them exactly what Leon Sullivan told you. I said, look, I don't know what you guys think. I said, but if we don't evolve our followers and our organization, we'll be out of business in 10 years. Exactly. And they said, well, how do you? I said, we will be out of business, man. I said, this is not a choice. We have to grow these young professionals, and you guys just have to get used to the fact that sometimes they're going to be disruptive. And I told them in a big meeting down in Florida, I said, like some of you all were, when you all joined this movement, and you in your 20s and you disrupted what was going on. Right. I said, so don't try to pretend that you haven't been part of disruption. I said, and of course, everybody laughs a little bit and says, yeah, I guess you make a point. But I want to compliment you because I thought that was a brilliant step.
Let me make another thing that greeted me when I took over the league was a story in Emerge magazine. I don't know if you remember Emerge. It was
it was George Curry's magazine. Yeah, George Curry's magazine.
Yeah. Well, I was greeted about a month after I took the job by a cover story. Is the National Urban League dead? And that was, they didn't interview me for it. They had no idea where I was hoping that the organization would go, and it was prior to my keynote address. The National Urban League was 84 years old at the time. Now, I know it's unkind of me to say, but I can't resist. Emerge has long since gone out of business, with the National Urban League is 111 years old now, thanks to your leadership. I used to say, and you remember this, and you've got it at Pine Street, we created this wonderful history of the Urban League movement told through the tenures of the 8 CEOs.
Right.
We've taken that, and I used to say to my colleagues at the league, when you arrive every morning, I want you to look at that history on the wall. And I want you to understand what our forebears have created, number one. The second message is, we ain't gonna mess this up. So we
ain't gonna mess this up, right? I mean, and I think you're right. I look at it's a weighty responsibility, I think, to be the leader of the movement. I mean, your contributions, I think, to the young professionals, education, rebuilding the board in a great way, gave me a starting point, a platform to try to continue to build the movement. And that's the key. The key is evolution, continuous evolution. meeting the moment, meeting the
Meeting the
time,
moment, exactly.
and not being afraid to take a few risks along the way. But I tell people all the time that the National Urban League has to be confident to be what it is, and not try to be anyone else, because if we didn't exist, someone would be trying to invent a National Urban League style organization. I can guarantee you that. Talk as we close, Hugh, your perspective on the times in which we live. We live in fascinating, interesting times, that unpredictable times, with crises and challenges and chaos. And what are your thoughts? What do you think? What wisdom, what thought, what perspective would you give us on these times?
Well, the first thing I'd say, and this is again a shout out to the league and to your leadership. I think we understand more today that the civil society and the organizations that make up the civil society are going to have to take lead responsibility for restoring civility in our country. Whatever policy wars we may have and however passionately we may fight them, we've got to restore civility and a sense of common values. So that work continues. I salute all the young people who are deeply involved in the Black Lives Matters movement. They've taken that whole protest movement up to a whole nother level of impact. But I just want to say to them, having lived through this in the 60s, when you're deeply involved in protest movements, understand that you have company, and not all the people involved in those movements are on your side. And when I headed the Black Coalition of New Haven in 1967 and 68, we were infiltrated, we were wiretapped, and I learned early on that you don't always know who is standing by your side. So don't do anything dumb.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you say that, because in the 80s, I was involved in the New Orleans Anti-Apartheid Coalition.
Yeah.
And it was a broad coalition of activists and others. And it was clear when you went to a handful of meetings, most of these communities are communities where people know each other.
Yeah.
And if someone you don't know shows up,
you're right.
You're like, who is that?
Who
invited them?
That's right.
Because people didn't show up to these types of things randomly. These communities like New Orleans and Cleveland, they're not like New York, right? Which is an endless stream of people in and out. Right. And it became clear, that governmental interests were continuing to do what they did in the 60s. And I think it's great word for the wise. I had a sense that in Ferguson all the way back, that there were people involved who were there only to disrupt. Absolutely. And only to sow chaos and confusion. And there is a continuing effort.
You don't even know who sent them.
Yeah, and there's always an effort to try to create generational divisions and fissures amongst those of us who work. And we have to realize that learn from the past, don't play into people's hands, don't get baited into doing things that are counterproductive.
Now, I think we've got big policy challenges. I think the Biden administration really got to pay attention to the everyday needs of everyday people in ways that we haven't in a long, long time. Minimum wage, job creation, obviously the environment, those are big ticket items, huge issues. But we've done big ticket things before for the private sector and for the wealthy. So it's time that working people and poor people be front and center in the agenda, and they should not be apologetic about that.
We have created an environment that has produced the enormity of wealth over the last 25 years, an enormity of wealth and largesse and billionaires. And I mean, we're moving into the eon of trillionaires in this country. And you couldn't be more profound in terms of that thought process. So we've got lots of people following, and I want to thank them for joining today. Hugh, any last words before we adjourn?
Well, I think the struggle against racism is perpetual, just as the struggle against anti-Semitism is perpetual. So all of these poisons in our culture have to be dealt with. They have to be nullified. And now that we've seen it cross over into domestic terrorism, Merrick Garland and Biden got their hands full, but they've really got to deal with that. And we as a people have got to adjust to and compete in a global economy that waits for nobody And so that's why I've always believed that focusing on the academic and social development of our children so that they're able to compete is critically important. So the work continues, and we need successive generations of young people getting deeply involved, and they ought to start on the ground and work their way up. They ought to understand that the way the campaigns were carried out in the past were a function of the way the times were in the past, and the people in the past may not have accomplished everything, but they've accomplished a lot. And we need to build on those legacies and on that knowledge. So it's just exciting to me that under your leadership, the league is going strong, and it's got a full plate, obviously, and country's got a lot of work to do. Got a lot of work to do. It's unlike any. I mean, I was a child during World War II. It's unlike any era that I remember in my lifetime.
Important point. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugh Price, the 7th president of the National Urban League, a great civil rights leader, intellectual, thought leader, who continues to serve the nation in so many important ways. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today. We're going to see you sometime soon. At some point soon, we're going to have, hopefully later on this year, a great big event in Harlem as we celebrate the breaking of ground for our new building there.
Right.
We're actually going to start construction before we break ground, but we're going to have some sort of event there when things clear and things are a little bit better. And we'll look forward to having you with us, because that project stands on the work of every leader of the Urban League since 1910. So Hugh Price, thank you for being with us. Hey, this is ReMarcs Live. I'm Marc Morial. Appreciate you all joining. One last thing, the COVID relief bill, the Biden COVID relief bill, we have an advocacy campaign going right now. We want you to weigh in to encourage the Congress to adopt that bill. It's got many, many important provisions in it: minimum wage, housing rescue dollars, money for cities and states, money to help schools reopen. It's important, it's big, it's bold. You need to weigh in and let your member of Congress know that you support that bill. And you can go to our website at nul.org. You can follow us on social media at Marc Morial, at Nat Urban League. We've got a way you can just click a link and send a letter to your member of Congress, or you can call 202-224-3121 and weigh in. I'm Marc Morial. This is ReMarcs Live. We'll see you Thursday. God bless. Stay safe. Stay healthy.
Okay.
All right. All right.